Chapter 14. Teague's return to Oakshade was marked in its simplicity. He fell back into the rhythm of the house after his week away with such ease that in little more than an afternoon King's Place, Johnson's Island, and Henry seemed separated from him by years, not the day and a half it had taken him to get back to Newkirk. Writing letters to Will and Henry fit nicely into his schedule of journal-keeping, Anna Lee watching, and newspaper story fabricating. He sent off the letters regularly, and though he enclosed paper for Will to write back, he received replies only from Henry. At the end of November, Dr. Warner took him to Philadelphia to fit him for an artificial limb. But even that change seemed minor at first because he still used the crutches, and since his transition from crutches to a cane came so gradually, by the end of January he couldn't recall exactly when he started using the cane exclusively. There was only one change in the last months of 1863 and the first of 1864 that garnered any real attention. Rebecca. Teague could tell the day he returned from Sandusky that she would not live to see the spring. Though she looked exactly as she had when he left, his week's absence lent him new perspective. Her family knew too. She knew it herself, but no one spoke of it until the day after New Year's, when she took to her bed permanently. Finally they sent for John, but when after 2 weeks he had neither answered the telegrams nor returned to Newkirk, they knew he would not come. Teague expected Anna Lee to stay close to her sister's side, but found instead that she focused more on keeping Lucy out of the room, and occupied with more attention from her aunt than she'd ever received. Throughout January, Anna Lee piled Lucy's thin baby hair atop her head and pretended to be a gentleman stepping out with his lady. Or she climbed with her to the barn loft, making a fort against the heathen mice out of piles of hay. Or she tucked Lucy's skirt into a triple layer of pantalettes and stockings, and bundled off into the woods with her on the trail of a hare or squirrel. Only at night, when Lucy was asleep in her trundle bed, now moved to her grandparents' room, did Anna Lee sit up with Rebecca and read aloud from Shakespeare as she had done for so long. Though her sister was more often than not in a morphine-induced stupor, Anna Lee persisted in altering her hushed voice to fit the characters, unaware that Teague sat listening in the next room with his pencil poised, but his journal page blank. The 26th of January dawned with an awful brilliance, the sunlight doubly bright from the clearness of the air and the reflection of the snow that had fallen there in the past 2 days. But after dark, clouds again hid the stars and flew rapidly over Oakshade with the wind that announced another snow. Teague had volunteered to read the men's parts in King Lear, after telling Anna Lee that she couldn't play them right, and was in the middle of Lear's diatribe in the storm when Dr. Warner came into the sick room to replenish the supply of morphine in Rebecca's veins. She waved him off for a moment and sat up in the bed, a move of only a few inches from the stack of pillows that kept her propped up and her airway at least partially open. "I want to write a letter before you drug me," she said between gasps of air. She pointed to her desk for him to bring her paper and pencil. While she wrote the short note, she said, "I hate when you stick me. I'm scared I won't wake up." She put the note on her nightstand, leaned back against her pillow, and raised her sleeve to bare her arm. Warner searched for a vein, but they were all blown, just like they had done in her other arm. He touched the needle bruises that had turned her arm the color of gangrene, and spoke barely above a whisper. "I can't do it here. Let me try your hip." Teague helped turn her over, and though he tried out of respect not to watch, he saw the bruises from countless injections on her hip, and winced with her when Warner plunged the needle under her flesh and pulled it out again. He listened to her rapid breathing, to her hungry heaves at air like the tugs of a weaning calf at her mother's milk. "Is Lucy asleep?" Rebecca asked. "Yes." "Have Mama leave a lamp burning for her. I think you all should stay here tonight." Teague stood back from Rebecca's bed and leaned against the doorway. He felt more out of place in this house than he ever had, as he watched Anna Lee finish Lear by herself while her mother embroidered on a hoop and her father stared out the window. Rebecca stared with him, struggling to stay awake even as she struggled to breathe. She turned her head toward the open door and nodded for Teague to look at what she saw. The lamplight from 2 bedrooms crossed in the hall and illuminated Lucy standing there with her head bowed and her eyes shut. She wavered on her feet as she snored lightly, catching herself if she leaned too far one way, and then standing still again without a moment's consciousness. "I'll take her back to bed," Teague said as he picked her up with one arm while leaning on his cane with the other. "No," Rebecca stopped him. "Bring her here." Annalie put the book down and joined her parents in watching Teague lay the sleeping figure on a pillow Rebecca pulled from her own stack. Rebecca reached out to move Lucy's hand from under her cheek and held on to it. She stroked the child's fingers and suddenly let out a short cry. "She's so little." She looked to her papa. "She won't remember me." Dr. Warner stood to hug her close to him, but arched back when blood erupted from her mouth and spurted halfway down the bed. She tried to cough the rest of it out, but couldn't take in a breath to start. Teague watched as she clawed at her father's neck and darted her eyes around the room. Lucy started awake at the frantic movement and began to cry. Blood poured from Rebecca's mouth as she thrashed around in the bed, trying to find some position to alleviate her suffocation. Teague pulled Lucy out of the bed, and then buried her face in his shoulder as he limped out of the room and down the hall. He sat with her in the chair beside her trundle bed, rocking his body to hush her. "What's wrong?" he heard her saying through the sobbing. Rebecca's bed was creaking like it would fall through the floor, and he wished he could shield Lucy's ears from the sound. "Your mother's just having another coughing fit. She'll be all right." Almost immediately after he spoke, the creaking ceased. Teague rocked a little harder and found his voice. "See? It's stopped." Lucy stopped crying and listened to the silence that was broken only by the blowing wind and the ticking clock in the hall. "Go back to sleep now," Teague said. "Grandma always sings to me." "What does she sing?" "Soul songs, like at church. I always go to sleep at church." Teague hesitated, trying to think of a slow hymn, trying to remember the words. Lucy nestled closer as he began in a voice barely above a whisper. "'Tis midnight, and on Olive's brow the stars dim that lately shone. 'Tis midnight in the garden now, the suffering Saviour prays alone." He glanced down to where Lucy lay watching his mouth form the words, and saw that her eyes closed during the second and third verses. The fourth verse he started just to make sure she was full asleep, but he faltered when he saw Dr. Warner step out of Rebecca's room and stop the hall clock. Then Annalie walked down the hall to her own room, and without a backward glance closed her door. Teague finished the hymn through clenched teeth. "Unheard by mortals are the strains that sweetly soothe the Saviour's woe." 30 December 1862. Dear Mrs. Scott, I am writing on behalf of your son, who has been under my care here for these last 3 months. He came here after his injuries at the Battle of Antietam, and since that time I had observed remarkable improvement in his physical condition. However, this week has seen a rise in the number of acute fevers, and I am afraid Captain Scott is among those taken ill. The doctors believe it is pneumonia, contracted as a result of his overwork in assuming the task of translating into Italian one of his fellow patients' letters, in combination with his tendency to leave the ward on clear nights to gaze at the stars. Please refrain from placing any blame for his illness on Captain Scott, as I should have been more diligent in keeping him indoors, but for my appreciation for his love of beauty. I noticed early in his stay here that he was more attuned to such simple pleasures than most men, and indeed he has become one of my favorites, almost as a son to me. He asked me after his first few days here to write you in the last pages of this journal should he ever be near death, but for all our sakes, it is my most fervent prayer that I am unjustified in my writing. If in fact he is lost to us, I will send this journal to you in the most expedient manner available to me. In that unhappy event, I am your most sympathetic friend, Martha A. Penning. 4 January 1863. My dear Captain, I hope you will forgive my presumption in writing to your mother when you know how I rejoice at your apparent recovery. Dr. Warner has returned, and like the prophets of old, he predicts you will not break any hearts in that manner for years to come. I do look forward to you opening your eyes and calling for your old Miss Penning as you did before. M. Penning. Tuesday, 6 January 1863. I am mortally tired, so I will simply write that Miss Penning is the dear of dears.